Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. If you're new to the channel, I'm a long-time professional poker player who specializes in the low stakes. So if you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. Here on my channel, I analyze every notable hand that I play in fine detail, whether I win or lose, so that you as the viewer can get into my mindset and hopefully improve your own game. This video will be a double header. First featuring a session I played of 2-5 and then a session of 1-3 that I played on another day. As usual, we'll be playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 1500, which is 300 big blinds. Alright, let's start this video with a hand I totally brutalized. This goes to show you that even professional poker players make mistakes, and you don't need to be completely perfect to be profitable in the low stakes. It's a half hour into the session, and we're currently on a short 6-handed table. This is kind of what happens when you waltz into the casino at 6 in the morning, right? I finally get a playable hand and open to 15 on the button with pocket 10s, which is the same sizing I would use with all of my incredibly weak button open hands as well. If I were in any other position, I would probably open to 4 or 5x, but the blinds rarely have anything worth defending, and I am disguising my hand strength using the same open size I would use with, for instance, 4-5 offsuit. Surprisingly, the small blind 3-bets me, but only to a very small sizing of 35 bucks. He only just sat down at the table and is sitting there with a stack of 1200. This is an incredibly peculiar bet sizing, and is something I expect to see over in the 1-3, not really in the 2-5. If this were coming from a 1-3 player, it could be a sign of immense strength. 1-3 players make the mistake of 3-betting small with their monsters all the time because they sit there waiting for big pocket pairs all day, and they absolutely can't stand it when everyone folds. And I have admittedly seen such a move deployed by a few 2-5 players over the years with very strong hands as well, but those instances are few and far in between. More often than not, this is just some sort of weird pot builder designed to kick out the big blind and get this hand heads up. Surely enough, it gets the desired effect as the big blind puts in the fold. Our hand strength is way bigger than usual for our opening raise on the button, so I fire back with a 4-bet to 115. Our opponent starts to play with his chips as he tanks noticeably. If he puts in a 5-bet here, I'm gonna just fold and catalog this player into the category of strange recreational players who 3-bet tiny with monstrous hands. Instead, he eventually only just puts in the call. The flop comes deuce, ace, 7, rainbow. Admittedly, that ace is not ideal. Interestingly enough, our opponent leads with a bet of 125 into the pot of 235. This is a very strong, slightly over half pot size bet, on a board with no noticeable draws of any kind. Coming from a recreational player who called a pretty large sized 4-bet, I should just fold here. That's what I should do. But instead, with only one overcard to my pocket pair, I decide to make a tentative call, investing a lot more money into the pot when I could have just simply given up on the 115 I've already fired out into the ether. There's nothing quite like the feeling of throwing more money at a dying investment. I mean, there's a freaking ace on the flop, and our opponent has taken not one, but 2 very strange lines so far. The vast majority of players would check such a flop to the original raiser, considering an ace-high flop is much more heavily leaned towards my range compared to his. Regardless, like an absolute tool, I make the call. The turn pairs the board with another 7, diamonds this time, putting 2 diamonds on board. Now not only do I lose to an ace, I also lose to a 7, and once again, our opponent leads with another stagnant bet of 125. Honestly, I'm only beating a stone-cold bluff here, considering the lack of draws on this sort of board. But since our opponent is using such strange bet increments, I decide to put in yet another call. The river doesn't change much with an 8 of hearts. We do not in fact improve. For a third time, our opponent fires out the same stagnant bet of another 125. Okay, let's reevaluate. Our opponent is obviously a very eccentric player. He hasn't done anything that is even remotely close to standard during this hand. What am I realistically beating? We have the hand range advantage here. I could easily have ace-king, or even pocket aces. Calling the flop bet was bad enough, but at this point, facing these small stagnant bets, I should definitely turn my hand into a bluff. Our opponent would be hard-pressed to call a shove here with ace-jack, or even ace-queen. It would make sense to play defensive poker if our opponent had dialed up the heat on the turn or the river, but he led with the exact same amount as he did on the flop. But in the moment, it's 6:30 in the freaking morning, and I had only just woken up, so I decided to play lazy poker and only just flat call. Only to have our opponent table pocket queens. Pocket freaking queens to own my soul with the larger pair that's still smaller than the ace. He played this hand so incredibly weird, and I ended up paying him the max. So much for all my flexing about being a long-time professional poker player, right? Time to watch me butcher more hands and laugh at my misfortune. The very next hand, under the gun opens to 15. The middle position calls. Sitting here with Jack 10 of hearts in the cutoff, I have a great hand to 3-bet in position since we're playing so deep. I would definitely not make this sort of play in a game with only 100 big blind structure, for instance. So I 3-bet the action up to 50 bucks. Surprisingly, everyone else folds, including the original raiser, but it's the middle position who makes the call. The flop comes 4, 8, 4 with 2 clubs and a heart. We don't flop anything at all, except a couple of random overcards and some weak backdoor draws. Our opponent checks. As per usual, on these small paired boards, I start with the down bet to 40 into the pot of 120, which is something I would do here with my entire range of hands, regardless of whether I'm holding trips, an overpair, or in this case, absolute squadouche. Undaunted, the middle position makes the call. The turn brings in a deuce of clubs, completing the front door flush. Our opponent checks again. If he were holding some sort of small pocket pair here like 5s through 7s, he's really not going to like withstanding too much continued heat. So I continue the aggression with another bet of 110. Surely enough, this does the trick as our opponent lets go of his hand, and we take down the pot with Jack high and no draw of any kind. Okay, so this Aero guy is playing like a complete maniac. Let's continue watching, and maybe we can see another rampage in the making. 15 minutes later, under the gun opens to 20. The middle position and cutoff both call. I'm sitting here holding Jack 7 of spades, which is an absolutely terrible hand. It's a freaking suited triple gapper. We're not even talking about a single gapper or a double gapper, but a triple gapper for crying out loud. Even if by some miracle we flop a straight on an 8, 9, 10 flop, we would be drawing completely dead to Jack Queen. However, I'm going to make this call for one very important reason. I'm on the button. I open my hand range almost infinitely on the button that I wouldn't play in any other position. Position is an incredibly powerful tool that you need to learn to utilize if you want to take poker seriously. So the small blind ends up folding, but the big blind makes the call. We go 5-handed in position to flop of 10, 6, 8 rainbow with 1 spade. We flop a gut shot straight draw with an overcard as well as a backdoor flush draw. Overall, this is not a terrible flop. Hitting a 9 would most likely be good. Hitting a jack could be good a portion of the time here as well, and we also have about a 4% chance to hit a backdoor spade draw, which counts for roughly 1 extra out. The action checks around to the cutoff, who throws out a very considerable bet of 70 into the pot of 100. If he only has a single pair holding here, we have the equivalent of about 8 outs to improve, which is the same as if we had an open ender, and we do have position after all, so I put in the call, and everyone else folds. The turn brings in a 7 of hearts, keeping the board rainbow, meanwhile putting a 1 card straight on board. Any 9 makes a straight, and Jack 9, which would have flopped an actual open ender, just improved to the nuts. As expected, our opponent switches modes to a check. If he had a hand here like 10 queen, 10 king, or something similar, he's really going to hate seeing aggression here, considering he's drawing completely dead to a straight. Not only would he have to call our turn bet, he might also have to call another large river bet. There's a reason I decided to play this otherwise incredibly terrible hand on the button. I have position to all other players and can pull off the move I'm about to make. I throw out a bet of 130 into the pot of 240. Surely enough, our opponent folds instantly, so we get another bluff through against the same opponent. Can I win with an actual hand for a change? Is that so much to ask? 20 minutes later, we've since picked up another player, so we start this one 7-handed. Here I open to 15 in the middle position with 8-10 of clubs. The cutoff, button, small blind and big blind all call. So we go 5 ways to flop of 6, 4, 3 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop a flush draw with 2 overcards, which is actually a well above average flop given our particular hand. The small and big blinds check. With such a high equity draw, I start with a 3/4 pot size bet of 55 into the pot of 75. I love being able to take down my high equity draws using fold equity, but if that doesn't work, I can still win by actually making a hand or bluffing in the event that I miss completely. So for my considerable bet, everyone else folds, but the small blind makes the call. I'm guessing he most likely has a hand like an open-ended draw, or possibly even a pair and a straight draw. The turn brings in a 4 of diamonds, pairing the middle card. Small blind checks again. This is actually a really good card. As long as our opponent didn't actually improve with this card, we'll be able to use this card to bluff on the river, if it comes down to that. Let's say instead of 8-10 of clubs here, we were actually holding pocket 8s or pocket 10s. That 4 on the turn will greatly reduce the number of outs a hand like 6-7 or something similar can make, considering making 2 pairs by the river will no longer be good against an overpair. So when the small blind checks, I increase the aggression with a bet of 100, fully prepared to blast off with a huge bet on the river in the event that we don't improve. Our opponent quickly makes the call, which is a timing tell that he definitely does not have a 4, otherwise he'll consider his options for a bit longer. The river brings in an absolutely gorgeous 8 of hearts. We do not in fact hit the flush, but there's no telling if a 10 high flush might have been good. This 8, on the other hand, is most likely a good card for us. We now beat a naked 6, and even a hand as strong as pocket 7s. So when our opponent checks for a 3rd time, instead of throwing out a massive river bluff, I switch our tactic up and decide to go for value. I want to choose an amount that he won't be able to resist. I think our opponent most likely has a hand like 5-6, or at least that's the hand we're going to target. A missed straight or flush draw won't be able to call a bet of any sizing, so we can go ahead and disregard those sorts of hands altogether. I want to target a 6 very specifically, or maybe a hand like 3-5 if our opponent doesn't put us on anything. Sure, there are plenty of hands that have us beat right now, and a lot of recreational players might be tempted to check in this spot now that they have some decent showdown value. However, I want to inch out every little edge whenever possible. Being profitable at poker doesn't mean getting lucky with big hands. That's nonsensical. Luck is a fabricated concept that a true professional does not rely on. The law of large numbers states that probabilities will win out in the long run over any perceived lucky streak in the short run. Being profitable in poker is all about knowing when you have a slightly better hand than your opponent and how to extract the maximum. So I throw out a very annoying bet of 150 into the pot of 385. This bet sizing is designed to get a call from the various smaller pairs that won't be able to resist this price tag. Even against this small bet, our opponent begins to tank for almost a full minute. Listen to the original audio as I provoke him into a call by using the absolute truth. I rivered you this hand. I missed my flush draw. Surely enough, the speech play works, and our opponent flicks in a single calling chip. We table our hand, and it's good. We are finally back in the green with a respectable profit of $42. 20 minutes later, the cutoff opens to 20. I call on the button with ace-10 offsuit. It's not an amazing hand, but we do have the button. The small blind folds, but the big blind makes the call. The flop comes 8-4-10 with 2 spades and a heart. We flop top pair with top kicker, which is much more preferable to flopping an ace-high board. The action checks around to us. On this pretty connected board with 2 to a suit, I start with a rather large bet of 45 into the pot of 60. Surprisingly, the big blind check raises to 150 with a stack of about 1,000. It's Tom, the Frenchman, a fellow pro at the win, who's usually on the tighter side. He does occasionally throw the oddball bluff out here and there, but for the most part, he plays a much tighter game than I do, that's for darn sure. The middle position folds, and now I have a decision to make. Folding here would be nonsensical. I'm not that tight, especially after flopping top pair with top kicker against a capable opponent who has quite a few semi-bluffs in his range. Tom would never do this with the naked 10, so we can throw that right out the window. For his value hands, he could have a set of 4s, a set of 8s, or a hand like 8-10 suited. For his bluffs, he could have the obvious flush draw, or potentially even a hand like Jack-9 for an open-ended straight draw with an overcard. He only has about a 1k stack, so he's not super deep like you would expect from other professionals like myself who constantly top off. I weigh my options, whether to go all in or simply just call. If I were out of position, I think I would be much more heavily weighed towards shoving here, but since I do have position, I decide on just a flat call to reevaluate after the turn. As long as the turn doesn't change anything, we can change our stance on how we want to play the rest of the hand. Now, you may be wondering why in the world I would ever consider shoving here with a pair of 10s, even if I do have top kicker. You gotta remember that I'm up against a fellow professional, not your standard run-of-the-mill recreational player. When it's pro-on-pro action, and you suspect that one of them is getting out of line with a draw, you need to punish him to the max, so he doesn't try to bully you again in the future. You need to draw a line in the sand. If I were up against a recreational player making this sort of move, I would never in a million years consider shoving in this spot. So the turn comes, and it brings in a queen of hearts, completing the open-ended draw. Jack-9 now makes the nuts. Using this card as a potential scare card to his advantage, Tom fires out another terrifying bet of 300 into the pot of 360. Not only did Jack-9 catch up to make a straight, but now any flush draw containing a queen also has us completely crushed. This card definitely changes the board texture, so here I reevaluate and decide on a fold, only to have Tom proudly windmill pocket 9s across the table. Pocket freaking 9s. He decided to turn second pair into a bluff right on the flop. And now, maybe you'll understand why the dynamic is so different when the action is pro against pro, and why I considered just shoving. Regardless, we lose this one, so it puts us back in the hole again. Will I ever climb out? Will I ever see the light of day again? Will I have to cancel our holiday plans and disappoint the children with a Charlie Brown Christmas? 20 minutes later, the mill position opens to 15. The cutoff and button both call, when the small blind 3-bets to 90 with a stack of about 1400 or so. I'm sitting here in the big blind with pocket 7s. Now, if I were concerned that the middle position is the type of player who might have open raised with some sort of monster that's strong enough to 4-bet, being trapped between two aggressive opponents, I would need to fold in this spot. However, the middle position is an older gentleman, and he tends to raise to the strength of his hand. So since I highly doubt a 4-bet is coming, I'm getting more than enough odds to set mine with our pocket 7s, so I make the cold call. The middle position calls as well, but the other two players fold. The flop comes 5-7-5 with 2 spades and a club. We flop top freaking boat in a large 3-bet pot against 2 other opponents. Holy shite! Pack the car, baby. We're going shopping. Sadly, the small blind starts with a check. Wah wah wah. I would expect him to continue betting here on this sort of flop with his entire range, even if he's only just holding 2 random overcards. I don't want to scare our opponents off in case they're both holding dead draws, so I put in a check as well. But thankfully, the middle position saves the day when he leads with a bet. And it's not a small bet either. He throws out a 2/3 pot-sized bet of 210 into the pot of 300. It gets even better when the small blind makes the call. I'm sitting here licking my chops. Okay, strategy time. This moment is what separates professional poker players from recreational players. A recreational player in this spot thinks to themselves, I have nothing to lose, so I should only just smooth call here. If you're watching this video, that is most likely what you're probably also thinking to yourself. Am I right? However, this is not how a professional views this spot. A professional looks at this spot and thinks to him or herself, how do I make the most money from this hand? What types of hands do my opponents have here? Taking into consideration the pre-flop action, I am almost certain that both of my opponents have overpairs right now. If the small blind had flopped a flush draw, he would have just continued betting to try to take down the pot without needing to improve. The middle position could theoretically have a flush draw here, but since he's more of a conservative older gentleman, he's way more likely to also have an overpair as well. Even if one of our opponents does in fact have a flush draw, which I highly doubt and am even willing to bet against, it's best to build the pot now while they think they have outs. An overpair is almost never going to fold when the flop is this low. However, there are all sorts of cards that can come on the turn which would completely kill the action. If you're a recreational player and you're sitting here watching this video, I want you to change your perspective. Instead of thinking that you really don't have anything to worry about, try to think about how you can win the absolute most money from this hand. If an ace, a king, a queen, or a club hits the turn, and it doesn't in fact improve the hands of either of our opponents, wouldn't that just completely kill the action you could have otherwise have gotten out of this hand? Imagine if one of our opponents is sitting there with pocket jacks, and the other has pocket tens, or the two have very similar hands. How hard would it be for them to fold right here and now when the board is only 7 high, compared to if another scare card hits the turn? So with all of this in mind, I put in an extremely milky min click to 425. Yes, even with top boat. Even if I had flopped quad fives, I would still make the same play. Surely enough, my ploy works, as both opponents make the call. I was actually hoping to provoke the small blind into going all in with such a small raise, but I'll settle with just a call. At least he didn't fold. The turn brings in a 6 of hearts, not changing anything. It's not a pesky overcard, so we still do have the essential nuts. Small blind checks again. I want to continue betting here, but I want to use a size that will potentially get one, if not both of our opponents, to put in their entire stacks by the river. If I were heads up, I would actually choose a much larger sizing here, since there's no way our opponent would put us on a full house, raising immediately right on the flop. But since we are multi-way, even a small bet here, with proportion to the pot, is actually a very large bet, definitively in terms of chips. I actually backtrack just a tiny bit and allow my opponents to see a river card for the low price of only $400 into the pot of $15.75. I don't mind giving my opponents a very cheap price when they're drawing to at most 2 outs. Sadly, even against this very tiny bet, the middle position ends up folding, but the small blind still makes the call. This call is actually incredibly peculiar to me, considering he only has a stack of about 1,000 at this point, and making this call only leaves him about 600 behind. He's never getting the right odds here if he thinks he's behind. He may as well just shove all in. I mean, calling $400 for a 2-outer is just absurd when you only have a stack of 1K. It would only make sense if my opponent were making this call on a flush draw, but given how the hand has gone so far and how it's about to go, we can throw that possibility out the window. So the river comes, and wouldn't you know it, it's an action-killing ace of clubs, completing the front door flush and putting a very undesirable high card on board. We are no longer holding the essential nuts. Pocket aces has now caught up to take the lead, but if our opponent were to shove here, we're never folding when he only has $600 behind. If he actually did have a flush draw, this would be the point where he would shove all in, but instead he checks, and that makes Aero a very sad panda. Just like I figured, he most likely has an overpair to the 7 high board, and he's not gonna like this river card very much. Still, the pot is already $23.75, and bro only has $600 behind. How much am I supposed to bet here without going all in? I don't really have much of a choice unless I wanted to really needle him with a bet of like 200 to 300. Even with an all-in shove, our opponent might still call out of frustration, which I've seen opponents do plenty of times over the years. So I decided to just go for all of the beans and shove all in. And sadly enough, our opponent folds almost instantly, making a comment that I got incredibly lucky on the river. So I did not in fact get the last of his remaining $600, which is regrettable. But now let's replay this hand from the perspective of a recreational player. Let's say I only just smooth called the flop bet. On the turn, the action would check through to the middle position again, and after getting called in two different spots on the flop, I'm pretty sure his minor overpair will shrivel up pretty badly and he'll end up checking the action back. The river will definitely be an action killer, guaranteed. I will have missed out on over $800 the way I actually played the hand, and in most cases, the small blind should have shoved with his hand on the turn. He should have either shoved or folded. Calling in that spot actually makes no sense. So in most cases, I would have missed out on over $1,400 by only smooth calling on the flop. And this is why I'm always cautioning you guys to never slow play your hands. Even after flopping top freaking boat, I did not slow play. I was not concerned about losing the hand, I was concerned about making the max. So when I tell you guys over and over not to slow play your hands, it has a dual purpose, to both protect your hand as well as to try to get the most chips into the middle. If the middle position player had actually folded on the flop and I was only heads up against the small blind, I would actually shove all in on the turn. Yes, even with top freaking boat. It would have been the play with the highest chance of getting a call from my opponent's overpair. He called my $400 turn bet, so without the middle position also in the hand, he would most likely have called a 1K all-in shove. 20 minutes later, the low jack opens to 15. I call on the button with Queen 9 of clubs, and the small blind and big blind call as well. Yes, this is a suited double gapper, but as you know, I call with all sorts of gobbledygook on the button. The flop comes 4, 6, 7 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop a flush draw with 2 overcards, which, with all things considered, is a much better than average flop. The action checks around to me, and this is exactly why I play these sorts of garbage hands in position. I throw out a pot-sized bet of 50 into the pot of 60, attempting to use fold equity to take down this pot right here and now. The small blind decides he's not going to make things that easy for me as he puts in the call, but the big blind and low jack get out of the way. The turn brings in a 7 of spades, pairing the top card. This is not ideal. We will never get a 7 to fold at this point, and on top of that, we've been reduced to only 7 outs in the event that our opponent really is holding a 7. So when the small blind checks, I make the rational choice and check the action back. The river saves us by bringing in a beautiful jack of clubs. We improve to a queen high flush, only losing to a king or an ace high flush, and a nonsensical full house, which should never be the case with how this hand has gone down. Small blind decides to take the lead with a bet of 125 into the pot of 160. Sure, I could just flat call here, but that's not how I roll. You don't need to have the nuts or anything close to the nuts to try to inch out every bit of value in a hand. There are only 2 flushes above ours, and many different flushes quite a few degrees lower that we can still inch out value from. So I put in a raise to 350. Unfortunately, our opponent makes a pretty quick fold, but it's still nice to finally hit a flush draw. After this hand, I play for another 45 minutes before deciding to rack up and call it an early morning. In for 1800 and out for 3209 for a delectable profit of $1,409 after only 3 hours and 2 minutes of playtime. So as you can see, even with my initial early session blunders, I still ended up profiting pretty huge on the day. No, I do not play perfect poker. Even with all of my experience, I still make mistakes all the time. That just comes with being human. As long as you have the wherewithal to acknowledge your own mistakes, you have the ability to overcome them and grow as both a human being and as a poker player. This was a rather short 2-5 session, so let's jump right to a 1-3 session I played a few days later. A couple of fans said they'd be in town, so I tried putting in a few extra sessions during the week to improve their odds of bumping into me. We'll be playing 1-3 No Limit Hold'em at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for 500, which is the max. A couple minutes after sitting down to the 1-3, I open to 10 under the gun with pocket 8s. The middle position and hijack both call, but after the small blind folds, the big blind suddenly 3-bets to 25 with a large stack that covers me. Now, if this were a 2-5 game, I would consider this sort of small raise nonsensical, but this is the 1-3, and as we all know, people in the 1-3 league do all sorts of weird things. As I featured before on the channel, the last time I mistook this sort of small raise as weak, I got punished with an all-in 5-bet shove. I swore I would not be making that mistake again. So I make the only rational play and smooth call, and the middle position and hijack calls as well. If the big blind has an actual big hand here, a more appropriate raise would be closer to about 60 bucks. He's out of position, and you're really only inviting players to crack your kings or aces when you 3-bet this small. You definitely do not want to take a single pair type of hand 4 ways. So the flop comes, and wouldn't you know it, it's 8, Jack, 9, rainbow. We flop bottom freaking set, but it's on a pretty connected board. Queen 10 would have flopped the nut straight, but that aside, this is a pretty darn fantastic flop, especially for a 3-bet, 4-handed pot. It gets even better when the big blind leads for a pot-sized bet of 90 into the pot of 101. Okay, this is a really connected board. Any 10 flops an open-ender. We are almost certain the big blind has an overpair here. The problem with making a full pot-sized bet after 3-betting pre-flop is that he's playing his hand face up. Now you guys know how I feel about slow playing. Not only do you open yourself up to losing, but you also miss out on building the biggest pots, since potential scare cards can completely kill the action. Any 7, queen, or another jack on the turn will have any overpair like kings or aces totally slam the brakes. We do not want that to happen. We want him to put in all the beans right here and now while he's currently unable to fold. So even though I flopped a set on a rainbow board, I put in an immediate raise to 200. The middle position gets out of the way, but since the hijack has barely over 200 bucks remaining, he also announces all in. The big blind ponders his options for a moment. Is he really going to be able to get away from an overpair here? Most low stakes players don't have that sort of discipline. Surely enough, our opponent reshoves all in with a stack that covers us, and of course I make the snap call. We're only 2 minutes into the session, and we're already all in for all of our chips in a 3-way pot. The middle position says he has 9-10 for a pair and an open-ended draw. I don't want to slow roll our opponents, so I let them know right away that I flopped a set. The turn brings in a beautiful jack of clubs, improving our hand to a full house, and the 3 of clubs on the river is a welcome sight to behold. I fast roll our full house, and the big blind voluntarily flips over pocket aces for the overpair we suspected he was most likely holding. We scoop this nearly $1,300 pot only 2 minutes into the session. Alright, time for a timeout. How should the big blind have played his aces, you may be wondering? Well, for starters, his 3-bet pre-flop needs to be much, much larger. For a $60 raise, he's probably going to reduce the number of players down to just heads up with me. I do have position and a stack deep enough to set mine with, so I would still end up making the call. Since I started with a $10 open size, but still called a $60 3-bet, a middling pocket pair is most likely in my hand range. Either that or a dominated ace like ace-queen or ace-king, but that's much less likely considering my opponent is holding 2 of the aces. So when the flop comes jack high with 3 middling cards, all of which are within my set mining range, the big blind should have slowed down with a small down bet to maybe 40 bucks. Knowing me, I would have immediately raised that 40 to about 100. Of course, aces can't go anywhere just yet for that price, so he should realistically stick around for my small raise. When the turn card pairs the board with another jack, obviously aces needs to check. At which point, with bottom boat, I would actually really hate that jack pairing, since it doubles my opponent's effective outs. Another jack on the river would counterfeit me. So seeing that jack on the turn, I would bomb here for about 200. At this point, aces would shrivel up pretty badly. He's only beating a semi-bluff, and I doubt anyone in the 1-3 league would be betting just a naked 10 here that strong. So he should make the disciplined fold. Played like that, he could have saved himself about 400 bucks. Okay, Aero, but isn't this being a bit too results-oriented? What if we switch up the turn and the river card instead? How is aces supposed to get away from this hand if the turn were a 3 of clubs. Okay, so if the turn were 3 instead of the jack, aces should still check to me since I raised them on the flop. Since I already put my opponent on an overpair, I would proceed here with a bet of about 150. Okay, so at this point, aces needs to make a decision. He can't simply just call the 150 hoping for a 2-outer. He needs to decide what sort of player I am. Am I the sort of whack job who would call a $60 3-bet with a hand like ace-jack when he's actually holding 2 of the aces? Kings or queens can most likely be taken out of the equation because I would have most likely 4-bet those sorts of hands. So you have to ask yourself, what sorts of hands is aces currently beating that I think I'm betting for value? Well, he's beating ace-jack, but that possibility is ultra rare. He's beating a 10, but pocket 10s would most likely only just smooth call the flop instead of playing it with ultra aggression. Okay, so now let's evaluate what sorts of hands our opponent is currently losing to. He's losing to a set of 8s, a set of 9s, a set of jacks, and 8-9 suited. In terms of value hands, he's losing to a lot more hands than he's beating. So from a disciplined player, like for instance, if this were an Aero versus Aero type of situation, I would actually fold aces at this point, believe it or not. But let's say you're not up against Aero, and your opponent is just some rando. In this situation, you're losing to all of the sets, but you're beating pocket queens and ace-jack, with pocket queens being the most likely hand combination. If you really think your opponent is the sort of player who only opens for $10 with pocket queens, but then doesn't re-raise when you 3-bet to 60, then here you need to shove. But in all honesty, I don't think very many players would play pocket queens that way. Okay, so now let's leave the world of theory for a moment and go back to the hand the way it played out. When aces bet full pot on the flop in a 4-way hand, and he gets not only raised, but then an all-in shove after that, it should be a clear fold. Anyways, that's the Aero analysis of this hand from the perspective my opponent should have taken. About 15 minutes later, under the gun limps, I put in a tiny pot builder with Jack 9 of clubs in the middle position to $8. If you watch enough of my videos, you will recognize this small raise will never come from a strong hand. So when I make such a raise, I definitely open myself up to being exploited. However, the vast majority of low-stakes players are not professionals like myself. Yes, this is definitely not a GTO style of play. However, we're here to capitalize on opponent mistakes and tendencies, not try to play perfectly in a vacuum. So anyways, the hijack ends up 3-betting me, but to only $20, with a full starting stack of 500. When everyone else folds, this is a very clear call. I'm getting a great price to potentially take my opponent's entire stack, and I only need to call for 12 more bucks. The flop comes 8, 5, 2, with 2 clubs and a spade. We flop a flush draw with 2 overcards, and better yet, this low flop is most definitely weighted much more heavily towards our range than our opponent's. We still need information, however. There's no reason why our opponent can't have an overpair here, so I start with a check. On this wet, dynamic board, our opponent throws out an incredibly weak c-bet for only $10. Cool beans, we've gained all the information we need. Do you think any overpair here would realistically only bet $10 into the pot of 47 with multiple straight draws and the obvious flush draw? Especially from a 1-3 player? Because I think not. So I put in a check raise to 40. Notice I'm not using an egregious number. This is because I don't mind a call at this point. The best bluffs and semi-bluffs are the ones where we keep in our opponent and then take the pot down later. Since my check raise is still considerably smaller than the size of the pot, our opponent makes the call. The turn brings in a 5 of hearts, pairing the middle pair. It's not a club, and it's not a 9 or a jack either, so we do not in fact improve. At this point, many recreational players will lose their nerve and go back to checking again, since our check raise on the flop did not in fact work. However, our assessment of the situation has not changed. Our opponent should never have a strong hand here. I think he only has 2 random overcards, so I proceed with another bet, and again, there's no need to go girls gone wild here. I lead with a slightly under half pot size bet of 60 into the pot of 127. If our opponent calls here, with what we suspect is an ace-high sort of hand, we have quite a few outs to improve by the river, and if not, we still have the option of blasting the sphincter out of the pot with a massive bluff. Fortunately, it won't come down to that, as our opponent simply just folds, and we take down this pot with Jack high. I don't play another notable hand for over 45 minutes. Here I open to 10, in the middle position with 9-10 of spades. The low jack, high jack, cutoff, and small blind all call, but the big blind folds. We go 5-handed to flop of king, 6, queen, with 2 clubs and a spade. We flop a gut shot straight draw with a backdoor flush draw. When the small blind checks to me, even though this is the sort of board that will hit the majority of our range, there's no merit to c-betting into 4 other opponents with such incredibly low equity, especially when we're out of position, so I check as well, and thankfully, the action checks around. The turn brings in a miraculous jack of hearts, improving us to the second nut straight. We do admittedly lose to ace 10, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. When the small blind checks for a second time, since no one seems all that interested in this hand on the flop, I want to throw out a strong bet here for value, but I don't think I'll get all that much action from a full pot size bet, so I lead for 35. The low jack, a conservative, older gentleman, makes the call, but everyone else folds. The river brings in a 3 of clubs, completing the front door flush. Sure, it is possible that the low jack could have just completed his flush draw, but that aside, we still need to go for some value here after binking a magical gut shot. If we face a raise, we can react accordingly. Had the river been some innocuous card, like a 3 in a different suit, I would go for much heavier value here, with a bet closer to about 80. But with the board as it stands, I want to target a 1 or 2 pair type of holding with a value bet. That 3 of clubs on the river is going to limit how much we can charge an opponent with a weaker hand, so I lead for 40 into the pot of 123. Surely enough, our opponent makes a dejected call, so we take this one down. A few minutes later, we've since lost a few players, so we're down to only 6-handed for this one. Here, Under the Gun opens with the min raise to 6. I'm holding king-queen offsuit in the low jack. We have a well above average hand, and also positioned to the original raiser, so I put in a 3-bet to 21. I want to choose an amount that gives me commanding authority while in position, without going overboard and overplaying my hand. For my relatively small 3-bet, the big blind cold calls with a stack of about 320, but surprisingly enough, the Under the Gun original raiser folds. We go heads up in position to an absolutely gorgeous flop of king, 10, king, rainbow. We flop trip kings with an amazing kicker on a rainbow board. When the big blind checks, not being one to slow play, I throw out a slight down bet of 20 into the pot of 49. Undaunted, our opponent makes the call, and this is exactly why I advise you guys not to slow play, time and time again. You build bigger pots this way. So the turn comes, and heh boy, it's the king of clubs, improving our hand to freaking quads. Quad freaking kings. Our favorite reptile in the kaiju franchise. It gets even better when our opponent leads into us with a bet of $50. Okay, at this point, I think I should actually raise here. A 10 would have a really hard time folding. I'm going to admit that I don't play super nutted hands to the best of my ability, however. We're talking about hands that can't lose, like straight flushes and quads. They're about the only hands that I actually do slow play, and it sometimes causes me to lose out on value. Like here for instance. I think a min raise in this spot is actually the most profitable way to go, but instead I elect on just a smooth call. And wouldn't you know it, the river brings in an action-killing ace of spades. And of course our opponent checks. I'm not liking this card whatsoever. I should just go for tiny value here for like a $40 bet or something similar, but instead I get greedy and shoot out a slightly over half pot size bet of 100. My opponent doesn't think very long before putting in the fold. I'm much more casual and friendly when playing 1-3, so I show him that I did in fact have quads. Normally you don't want to show any of your hands unless you get called. You're just giving away free information otherwise. But I don't play 1-3 all that often, so I don't mind. About 20 minutes later, I post in the cutoff after missing my blinds. The action folds around to the small blind, who puts in a tiny pot-building raise to 11. The big blind calls. Even though I have 3-5 offsuit, which is a completely garbage hand, in case you didn't know, I do have position against the blinds, so I put in the call. Now, if you watch enough of my 1-3 series, you would know that I even fold hands like Jack Queen or King 10 offsuit in early position, even for a $3 limp. But I'm willing to call with 3-5 offsuit in late position to a raise. Let that sink in. That's how important I value position. So the flop comes 6-6-4 rainbow. We flop an open-ended draw on a super low paired board. The small blind starts with a slight down bet to 10. If he's any sort of decent player, he would do this with the entirety of his range, whether he's actually connected with this board, holding an overpair, or just 2 random overcards. The big blind calls. I weigh my options. I consider raising, and would most likely do so if I were heads up with the small blind, but I'm actually concerned about the big blind. There's no reason he can't have a 4 here, and if he does, raising would be complete suicide. I would lose out on all of my equity, since he would probably re-raise me into oblivion. So instead, I decide on just a call. The turn brings in a magical deuce of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board, but more importantly, it completes our straight. With 2 callers to his continuation bet, the small blind slows down and checks. The big blind starts stacking chips and throws out a bet of 35 into the pot of 63. If he was already boated with a hand like 4-6 or pocket 6s, he would have most likely just checked the action over. But since he led with a half pot size bet, I'm actually hoping he does have a 4 here, or maybe just a small overpair that he's unwilling to fold. So I put in a raise to 90. The board is paired, there are 2 hearts out there now, and plus I like building pots when I think I have the best hand. Unfortunately, both of our opponents pretty quickly fold, but we do take down this final last pot. After this hand, I play for another hour without anything significant happening. So when the table breaks, I decide to rack up my chips and call it an early night. In for 500 and out for 1775 for an absolutely amazing profit of $1,275 after 2 hours and 42 minutes of playtime. This 1-3 session was one of those really rare instances where I don't lose any considerable pots and everything just goes my way. But most sessions won't be that easy, so you gotta appreciate them when they happen. This episode was designed to air before the holidays, but it looks like that didn't go quite as planned. So here we are in 2026. Yay! Okay, jokes aside, I wanted to thank each and every one of you for your support this past year. It's been an absolutely amazing year. The channel has grown immensely, and so many people in Las Vegas has heard of the name Aero by now. If you like what you saw today, please don't forget to smash that like button. Hype this video if you can. Subscribe to the channel for more tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. Follow me on Instagram to get details on my monthly $500 cash drawings. Check out my Patreon to see more of the coaching series and to get early access to my vlogs. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.